The blaze that engulfed the Harrove plantation on the night of August 14, 1859 burned with such intensity that witnesses said its glow was visible from 12 miles away. By morning, only ash and the skeletal remains of 3 structures were left. That night claimed 17 lives, 16 enslaved workers and 1 white overseer. The county sheriff's official report, filed 3 days later, concluded the fire began with an overturned lantern in the tobacco barn. Yet the enslaved survivors whispered a different account among themselves, a story involving a young deaf man named Thomas, a cruel overseer named Virgil Crenshaw, and a chain of events so deliberate, so methodical, that historians examining the incident still debate what truly occurred. On one point they concur: the fire was planned. Someone desired those deaths, and someone walked away without a single scorch mark. Before we delve further into Thomas's story and that fateful night, I have a question. If you're listening from the South or any part of America where these old plantations still exist, leave a comment with your state. These stories, however uncomfortable, are our shared history. I'm curious where you're hearing this. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe, because the account you're about to hear will challenge everything you believe about justice, revenge, and survival. Now, let's return to Virginia in 1859, to a place where cruelty was law and silence proved the deadliest weapon. The Harrove plantation was located in Virginia's Tidewater region, roughly 40 miles south of Richmond, in a county where the James River fractured into dozens of small tributaries feeding the marshlands and tobacco fields. This was Old Virginia, settled in the early 1700s by English families seeking fortune in the New World. By 1859, the land had been worked for over a century. The soil was depleted in patches, still fertile in others, a quilt of productivity dictating which families thrived and which faded into genteel poverty. The Harroves existed in the middle of that spectrum. They lacked the wealth of the Randolphs or Carters, who owned thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved people, but they were not poor. Edmund Harrove's grandfather had bought the land in 1732 with profits from a Norfolk shipping business. He had built the main house, or rather, had overseen the enslaved workers who built it, a modest 2-story structure of brick and wood, painted white, with a wide porch facing east to catch the morning sun and the evening river breeze. The plantation spanned about 300 acres, with half usually under cultivation. The rest was timberland or had been allowed to revert to the pine forests and marshes that predated European arrival. Tobacco was the primary crop, though they also grew corn, wheat, and vegetables in smaller plots near the quarters. An orchard of apple and peach trees stood behind the main house, alongside a small vineyard planted by Edmund's father in a burst of optimism that never yielded more than sour, thin-skinned grapes fit only for vinegar. In 1859, the labor force consisted of 23 enslaved people, aged 6 to 62. They lived in 6 cabins arranged in 2 rows behind the tobacco barns, each cabin housing 3 to 5 people based on family size. Built from rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, they had dirt floors that turned to mud in the rain and wooden shutters in place of glass. A single fireplace served for cooking and heat, with children sleeping on straw mattresses in a loft. The enslaved community at Harrove was relatively stable for the region. Edmund Harrove rarely sold people away from their families, except during dire financial straits, once in 1851, when a poor tobacco crop and bad investments forced him to sell 3 young men to a trader bound for the deep South. The memory of that sale lingered in the quarters, the mother's wails, the sight of the men chained together and led down the Richmond Road. It was a stark reminder that their lives were not their own, that they could be shattered at any moment by forces beyond their control. Yet, for the most part, life followed a predictable rhythm. The work was relentless. Tobacco demanded constant care from April planting to September harvest, but no harder than on neighboring plantations. Rations were adequate if monotonous: cornmeal, salt pork, molasses, and vegetables from personal garden plots. Clothing allowances came twice a year: for men, 2 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, a jacket, and shoes; for women, 2 dresses, a shawl, and shoes. Children wore hand-me-downs until they were old enough for field work. Edmund Harrove himself was a widower in his late 50s, his wife and infant son had died in childbirth 2 decades prior. He never remarried, perhaps from lasting love or a loss of interest in domestic life. He spent most of his time in Richmond, where he kept a townhouse on Gray Street and sat on the board of a small bank. He visited the plantation monthly, sometimes less, to review accounts and inspect crops. By the standards of his time and place, he was not exceptionally cruel, nor was he kind. He viewed slavery as an economic system, a necessary evil. He treated the enslaved people as he did his horses and tools, valuable property to be maintained in working order. Day-to-day management fell to the overseer. For 2 years before Virgil Crenshaw's arrival, that had been William Porter, a competent but unambitious local farmer's son. Porter kept things running, but tobacco yields had declined steadily, frustrating Harrove. In the spring of 1857, he dismissed Porter and hired Crenshaw on the recommendation of a planter in the next county, a planter who wished to be rid of Crenshaw but was too polite to say so directly. Virgil Crenshaw was 32 when he arrived at Harrove, a tall, lean man with pale blue eyes and a face that seemed incapable of a smile. Born in North Carolina, he was the youngest son of a small farmer who lost his land to debt when Crenshaw was 15. Over 15 years, he had worked his way up from field hand to overseer, moving from plantation to plantation across Virginia and the Carolinas, never staying more than 2 years. There was always a reason for the move, a dispute with an owner, an incident with the enslaved, a sudden need for new employment, but the pattern was clear to anyone looking closely. Crenshaw left destruction in his wake. His reputation traveled through the enslaved community's underground networks, whispered conversations at Sunday markets, messages passed by traveling preachers and hired-out workers, songs encoding warnings in their lyrics. The reputation said Crenshaw enjoyed his work too much, took pleasure in wielding power, so the people under his control not as human beings but as animals to be broken. Upon arriving in April 1857, Crenshaw spent his first week observing. He walked the fields, inspected buildings, reviewed records, and, most importantly, watched the people. He noted who worked hard and who slacked, who had influence and who was isolated, who had family ties to exploit. He was methodical, building a mental ledger for a system of control based on fear, manipulation, and strategic violence. His first official act was to call a meeting of all enslaved workers on a Sunday afternoon. They gathered in the yard between the tobacco barns under the spring sun while Crenshaw addressed them from his cottage porch. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but with an edge that made skin crawl. "My name is Virgil Crenshaw," he said, "and I am the new overseer here. I'll make a few things clear. I don't care about the old rules. They're gone. Now you follow my rules, and they're simple: work hard, work fast, and don't give me trouble. Do that, and we'll get along. If you don't, you'll regret it. I don't make idle threats, and I don't give second chances. Do we understand each other?" No one answered. They stood silent and weary, knowing any response could be taken as insolence. Crenshaw smiled a thin, humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good. Now get back to your cabins. Tomorrow we start fresh." That night, in their cabins, the enslaved people spoke in low voices about the new overseer. They had seen men like him before, men who wore cruelty as a badge. They knew what was coming: increased quotas, arbitrary punishments, constant surveillance, and fear. What they didn't know was how far he would go or how long they would have to endure him. Within 6 months, Crenshaw had transformed the plantation. He reorganized work schedules, dividing people into gangs by age and strength, assigning specific tasks with daily quotas. He implemented punishments for failing to meet them: reduced rations, extra work, confinement in the windowless shed behind his cottage. For more serious offenses, talking back, attempting escape, striking another, the punishments were more severe, though Crenshaw was careful never to damage anyone so badly they couldn't work. His value to Edmund Harrove lay in extracting maximum labor while minimizing financial loss. But Crenshaw's real genius, if it could be called that, was psychological manipulation. He had a talent for identifying vulnerabilities and exploiting them with surgical precision. He knew who had children to protect, who had a sweetheart they couldn't bear to see hurt, who had pride to break, who had hope to crush. He used this to create a climate of fear and mistrust where people were afraid to help each other, show weakness, or draw his attention. One favorite tactic was pitting people against each other. He would tell one person another had informed on them, true or not, and watch suspicion tear apart friendships and families. He granted small privileges to certain individuals, extra food, lighter work, permission to visit a spouse on a neighboring plantation, and made sure everyone knew, seeding jealousy and division. He punished entire groups for one person's actions, forcing people to police each other out of fear of collective punishment. Tobacco yields soared under Crenshaw's management. In 1858, his first full year, production increased by 30%. Edmund Harrove was pleased, giving Crenshaw a bonus and telling him to keep up the good work. He didn't ask about the methods. He didn't want to know. But there was one person Crenshaw couldn't figure out, one person immune to his usual tactics, a person who watched him with eyes showing neither fear nor defiance, just a patient, calculating awareness. That person was Thomas. Thomas was born on the Harrove plantation in the spring of 1841, the son of Ruth, a cook in the main house. His father was unknown, Ruth never said, and no one asked. In the world of slavery, paternity was a dangerous subject. What mattered was that Thomas was Ruth's son, and she loved him with a fierce, protective intensity. Thomas had been deaf from birth, a result of a fever Ruth suffered in her last months of pregnancy. She had collapsed while working in the July heat. The plantation doctor diagnosed heat exhaustion and prescribed rest, but Ruth couldn't afford it. She returned to work, the fever persisting until Thomas was born 6 weeks later. He was a small, quiet baby. Ruth feared he would die. He survived, growing stronger, but it became clear he couldn't hear. Ruth noticed at 3 months, he didn't startle at loud noises, turn when she called, or cry with other babies. By 6 months, it was undeniable. In other times or places, a deaf child might have been seen as a burden, but Ruth was valuable, an excellent cook relied upon by Edmund Harrove's father for important guests, so Thomas was allowed to live and grow up in the quarters. Ruth ensured he learned to work, to be useful, so no one could call him worthless. As a child, Thomas developed his own communication system. He and Ruth created a language of signs, simple at first, then more complex. By age 5, they could have full conversations with hands and faces. Others in the quarters learned some signs, and Thomas learned to read lips with remarkable accuracy. His deafness shaped his life unexpectedly. Because he couldn't hear shouted orders, he worked closer to the main buildings, in the tobacco barns, curing sheds, carpenter's shop, blacksmith's forge. This granted him unusual independence, often working alone or with few others. It also meant he was present during conversations people assumed he couldn't understand. White people especially talked freely around him, thinking deaf meant stupid or incapable of comprehension. They were wrong. Thomas learned to be still and observant. He watched faces, read lips, noted body language and tone, seeing tension in shoulders, the set of a jaw, the movement of hands. He learned secrets spoken aloud in his presence because people forgot he was there or assumed he couldn't understand. By summer 1859, Thomas was 18, of medium height with his mother's high cheekbones and dark eyes, lean and strong from years of labor. He had her intelligence and a patient watchfulness, an ability to wait, observe, and think before acting. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it transformed his face, making him look younger and more vulnerable. Virgil Crenshaw tried to break Thomas as he broke others. He assigned impossible tasks, moving a brick pile back and forth to demonstrate power. He withheld food rations, accusing Thomas of stealing from the kitchen, though everyone knew it was false. He threatened to sell Ruth to a Georgia plantation, knowing separation was a powerful weapon. But Thomas simply endured. He moved the bricks without complaint, went without food for 3 days without showing weakness. When threatened with his mother's sale, Thomas looked Crenshaw directly in the eye with a watchful, patient gaze. It unnerved Crenshaw. Thomas's silence, his observational stillness, made the overseer feel exposed, as if Thomas could see through his tactics to the insecure, violent man beneath. Crenshaw knew how to crush defiance, but Thomas wasn't defiant. He was calculating, and that made him dangerous. The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late July, during a relentless heat wave. Temperatures had been above 90 degrees for a week, the air thick with humidity. Thomas was hanging tobacco leaves to cure in the barn, hot, sweaty work, but he preferred it to the fields. He was on a ladder near the back when he saw movement at the door. Crenshaw entered, followed by Sarah, the 19-year-old daughter of Jacob, the blacksmith. She was 7 months pregnant, moving with careful deliberation. Her husband, Daniel, was in the fields until sunset. Thomas watched as Crenshaw closed the barn door. Something in the overseer's movement and expression made Thomas's stomach tighten. He stayed still on the ladder, partially hidden, and watched. Crenshaw spoke to Sarah. Thomas couldn't see his lips clearly, but he saw Sarah's face, frightened. She stepped back toward the door, but Crenshaw blocked her path. He spoke again. Thomas caught some words. Been watching you. Time you showed some gratitude. Light work because of your condition. Sarah shook her head, hands protecting her belly. She spoke, but Thomas couldn't see her lips. Whatever she said angered Crenshaw. He grabbed her arm, fingers digging in hard enough to make her wince. Thomas didn't think, he acted. He climbed down silently, crossed the barn floor, and tapped Crenshaw's shoulder. Crenshaw spun, startled, still gripping Sarah's arm. For a moment, the three stood in the dusty light, the overseer, the pregnant woman, and the deaf young man who had interrupted something that could have ended badly for Sarah. Thomas pointed to the ladder, then the tobacco leaves, then Crenshaw. The meaning was clear, he needed help with the work. It was a lie, but it gave Sarah a chance to slip away. She pulled free and hurried out without looking back. Crenshaw stared at Thomas, his pale blue eyes cold with fury. Then he smiled that thin, humorless smile. He leaned in close, so Thomas could smell tobacco on his breath. He spoke slowly, clearly, for Thomas to read his lips. You just made a mistake, boy. A big one. And I'm going to make sure you regret it for the rest of your short life. Thomas didn't respond. He stood expressionless, eyes meeting Crenshaw's without flinching. After a moment, Crenshaw turned and walked out, leaving Thomas alone in the heat and silence. That night, Sarah came to Ruth's cabin in tears, her hands shaking as she signed her thanks to Thomas. Ruth held her while she cried. Thomas sat near the fireplace, watching the flames, thinking about what came next. He knew Crenshaw wouldn't let this go. Men like him never did. Their power depended on fear, and fear depended on the certainty that resistance would be punished. Thomas was right. The persecution began the next day. Thomas was assigned to clean the well, a dangerous, disgusting job. Lowered 30 feet in a bucket with a safety rope, he worked for hours in cold, damp air that smelled of rot, scooping mud and debris into buckets hauled to the surface. He emerged at sunset covered in filth and shivering. The next day, he repaired the tobacco barn roof, dangerous work on a steep, hot tin surface where a wrong step meant a 20-foot fall. He worked carefully, trying not to think how convenient a fall would be for Crenshaw. The day after, he hauled 100-pound sacks of grain from the storage shed to the mill, half a mile away, making 20 trips until his shoulders screamed and his legs trembled. Through it all, Crenshaw watched with cold blue eyes, waiting for Thomas to break, complain, give an excuse to escalate punishment. But Thomas never did. He completed every task without protest. He endured. Crenshaw wasn't satisfied with just exhausting labor. He cut Thomas's food rations, accusing him of stealing from the kitchen. It wasn't true, Ruth would never allow it, but Crenshaw didn't care about truth, only power. Thomas's rations were halved, half a pound of cornmeal, no meat. Ruth tried to share her food, but Thomas refused, knowing she would be punished too. He grew thinner, gaunt, but kept working, kept enduring, kept watching Crenshaw with that patient, calculating gaze that unnerved the overseer. The other enslaved people watched with sympathy and fear. They knew what Thomas had done, word had spread about him saving Sarah. They admired his courage but feared for him. They knew Crenshaw would keep pushing until Thomas broke or died, and that interfering would make things worse for everyone. Sarah was consumed with guilt, wanting to help but not knowing how. Her husband Daniel was furious but terrified. Confronting Crenshaw meant death for him and disaster for Sarah and their unborn child. Jacob, Sarah's father, was pragmatic. He had seen overseers come and go. The key was to keep your head down, do your work, and wait for change. But even Jacob worried about Thomas. Everyone had a breaking point, and Crenshaw seemed determined to find Thomas's. 3 weeks after the barn incident, Crenshaw escalated. He announced Thomas would be whipped for insubordination. The charge was absurd. Thomas had never said a word to him, but Crenshaw didn't need a real reason, just an excuse. The whipping was scheduled for Saturday afternoon in the yard between the tobacco barns, a public lesson. Ruth was frantic. She went to the main house and begged Edmund Harrove, visiting for the weekend, to intervene. He refused, saying discipline was the overseer's responsibility. He wouldn't undermine Crenshaw's authority. Ruth left in tears, knowing she couldn't stop it. But on Saturday morning, something unexpected happened. Crenshaw woke with a sudden, violent fever. He spent the day in bed, too sick to carry out the whipping. By Sunday, the fever broke, leaving him confused. He suspected poison but had no proof. He didn't know Ruth had slipped a small amount of ipecac root into his coffee Friday night. She knew how to prepare the wild plant, her mother had taught her. The dose made him violently ill but wasn't fatal. She wanted to buy Thomas time, not bring more attention. Time was running out. Crenshaw was more determined than ever to break Thomas and now suspected conspiracy in the quarters. He increased surveillance, watching for signs of resistance. The atmosphere grew more oppressive, more suffocating. People were afraid to talk, to meet each other's eyes. And Thomas was changing. The others saw it in his movements, in how he looked at Crenshaw when the overseer's back was turned. A cold calculation had entered his eyes. He was no longer just enduring. He was planning. Ruth noticed first. She could always read her son. One Sunday evening in mid-August, with the sky painted orange and red, she found Thomas outside his cabin, staring at the overseer's cottage. The intensity of his gaze, the stillness of his body, made her uneasy. She sat beside him, took his hand, and signed, "What are you thinking about?" Thomas looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he signed back, "Fire. I'm thinking about fire." A chill ran through Ruth. She knew he meant it literally. "Don't," she signed, hands shaking. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. They'll kill you." Thomas shook his head. "They'll kill me anyway. Crenshaw won't stop until I'm dead or broken. You know that." Ruth wanted to argue but couldn't. She had seen too many people broken by men like Crenshaw. Her son was right. "What are you going to do?" she signed, afraid of the answer. Thomas looked back at the cottage, where lamplight glowed in the windows. "I don't know yet," he signed. "But I'll think of something." Over the next few days, Thomas did think of something. He turned the idea over, examining every angle for flaws and risks. What he contemplated was dangerous, potentially catastrophic, but he saw no other choice. Crenshaw had to be stopped, and no one else would do it. The law wouldn't protect him, Harrove wouldn't protect him, the others couldn't without risking themselves. He had to act alone. The plan was simple in essence, complex in execution. Crenshaw had to die, but it couldn't look like murder. It had to look like an accident, impossible to prove otherwise. Fire was the answer, common on plantations, from overturned lanterns, forged sparks, lightning, spontaneous combustion in tobacco barns. A barn fire wouldn't be unusual. If Crenshaw was inside, trapped, it would be a tragedy, not a crime. The problem was getting Crenshaw into the barn at the right time and ensuring the fire spread too quickly for escape. Thomas watched Crenshaw's routines, noting his vulnerabilities. He also considered the consequences. 17 other people lived and worked there. A barn fire could spread. He didn't want to hurt innocents, but he saw no other way. He decided to set the fire late at night when most were asleep, starting it in a way that would give people time to escape if it spread. It wasn't perfect, too many variables, but it was the best he could devise. Unknown to Thomas, he wasn't the only one thinking about fire. Marcus, a 30-year-old field hand sold to Hero 5 years prior, had been watching Thomas's persecution with interest. He admired Thomas's endurance and recognized in him a shared willingness to do what was necessary regardless of cost. Marcus had his own reasons to hate Crenshaw, who had taken a particular dislike to him, perhaps because Marcus was strong and showed no fear, or because he had come from a plantation where an overseer was killed by enslaved workers. Crenshaw had made Marcus's life miserable, threatening to sell him away from Esther, the woman he loved who worked in the main house. Marcus had considered killing Crenshaw for months: poison, a knife, an accident, but each method was obviously murder, and he would be the suspect. Then he noticed Thomas staring at the tobacco barn, saw the look in his eyes, and understood. Thomas was planning something involving fire. Marcus decided to wait and watch. If Thomas's plan worked, Crenshaw would die without Marcus risking his life. If not, he would devise his own plan. There was also Hannah, 25, who worked in the kitchen with Ruth. She had grown up alongside Thomas and felt protective of him. She had watched his persecution with anger and fear, thinking of how to help. She didn't know about Thomas's or Marcus's plans, but she too had thought about fire since seeing Crenshaw corner Sarah. She knew the barn was full of dry, flammable material. A fire there would spread quickly, killing Crenshaw if he was inside. No one would suspect a kitchen worker with no reason to be near the barn. But she didn't know how to start a fire unseen, how to make it look accidental. She was still working on details when Thomas acted. On the evening of August 13th, Thomas saw his chance. Crenshaw had been drinking more than usual. Thomas, working late in the carpenter's shop, watched him stumble into his cottage around 9 p.m. Thomas waited until the plantation was quiet, the last lamps extinguished. Edmund Harove was in Richmond. Only 2 elderly caretakers slept in a cabin behind the kitchen house. The nearly full moon cast pale light over the yard. Thomas walked silently to the tobacco barn, the familiar path feeling different tonight. He was crossing an uncrossable line. He opened the door, its creak loud in the quiet, and slipped inside, closing it behind him. Moonlight filtered through wall gaps, striping the floor. The air was thick with the sweet, cloying smell of tobacco and dust. Thousands of leaves hung from ceiling racks, rustling slightly. Thomas moved confidently to the cluttered storage area at the back, a fire hazard of oil-soaked rags, dried straw, broken wood, empty barrels, and rope coils. Crenshaw didn't care about safety, only productivity. Thomas worked quickly. He piled rags against a main support beam, scattered straw as kindling, arranged wood to create a chimney effect, drawing flames upward to the dried leaves above. He lit a lantern from Crenshaw's matchbox, placed it on the floor near the rags, adjusted the wick to burn high and hot, and tipped it slightly, letting oil pool on the wooden floor. It would take 20 to 30 minutes to ignite, time enough for Thomas to be far away, for it to look like a careless accident, a lantern left burning, oil leaking. But he needed Crenshaw in the barn. He needed bait. Thomas left the barn and went to the overseer's cottage. The windows were dark. He picked up a stone and threw it at a window, hard. Nothing. He threw another, then another, until a lamp flickered inside. Crenshaw's silhouette moved past the window. The door opened, and Crenshaw stepped onto the porch, holding a lantern and a pistol, wearing only pants and an undershirt, barefoot, hair disheveled. "Who's there?" he slurred. "Show yourself or I'll shoot." Thomas stepped into the lantern light, hands raised. He pointed frantically toward the barn, his face twisted in panic, mouth moving as if trying to speak. Crenshaw squinted. "What? What are you trying to say, boy?" Thomas pointed more urgently, then walked toward the barn, looking back, beckoning desperately. Crenshaw hesitated, drunk and suspicious, but responsible for the plantation in Harov's absence. He couldn't ignore a warning, even from someone he hated. "This better not be a trick," he muttered, following Thomas, pistol pointed at his back. They reached the barn. Thomas opened the door. Inside looked normal, neat rows of tobacco leaves swaying in the breeze, no fire, no smoke. "What the hell are you playing at, boy?" "There's nothing." Thomas pointed to the back, to the storage area, his face still panicked. Crenshaw walked that way, boots echoing, lantern casting wild shadows. Thomas didn't follow. He stepped out, closed the door, and dropped the heavy securing beam into place, locking Crenshaw inside. He heard Crenshaw shout, pound on the door. Thomas walked away toward his cabin, face expressionless in the moonlight. Behind him, in the storage area, the leaking lantern ignited the oil pool. Flames caught the rags, straw, and wood. Within minutes, fire climbed the back wall, reaching the tobacco leaves. They caught like paper, embers floating to the roof. The fire spread horizontally along the racks, consuming everything. Crenshaw smelled smoke before seeing flames. He stopped pounding and turned. An orange glow spread at the far end, brightening rapidly, accompanied by a roaring wind-like sound, fire consuming dry wood and tobacco. He ran toward it, thinking he could put it out, but flames were already too high and hot. He tried stamping them out, but the leaves were burning, embers rising, heat intense, smoke thick and black, choking. He ran back to the door, threw his weight against it, the beam held. He shouted for help, his voice lost in the roar. Smoke filled the barn, heat blistering his skin. He looked for another exit, windows too high and small, a loading door chained and padlocked outside. He was trapped. The fire spread faster, racing along walls, consuming tobacco, racks, support beams. Heat became unbearable, his lungs burned, eyes streamed, skin blistered. He slammed his shoulder against the door again and again until the wood cracked but didn't give, his shoulder numb with pain. Then, through smoke and flames, he saw something that chilled his blood, a figure in the shadows near the back, just beyond the fire's reach, a young man with dark eyes and an emotionless face. Thomas. But that was impossible. Thomas was outside, had locked him in. Crenshaw blinked, clearing smoke. The figure was gone. A trick of the mind. Smoke, fear, whiskey. He would never know. The roof collapsed moments later, a shower of sparks and burning debris falling on him. He had time for one last scream before flames consumed him entirely. Thomas sat on his cabin steps as the barn collapsed. He felt the ground vibrate, saw sparks fountain into the sky. People emerged from cabins, shouting, pointing, faces orange in the glow. A bucket brigade formed from the well, but it was useless, the fire too big, too hot. They could only try to stop it from spreading. Ruth found Thomas in the chaos, grabbed his arm, her eyes searching his face. She didn't need to ask. "Where is Crenshaw?" she signed, hands shaking. Thomas pointed at the burning barn. Ruth paled. "Is he?" Thomas nodded. Ruth made a decision. She pulled Thomas toward the main house, where an elderly caretaker stood on the porch, watching fearfully. "We need to send someone to Richmond," Ruth said. "To tell Mr. Harov. Thomas will go." The woman nodded, shocked. Ruth turned to Thomas, signing urgently, "Go to Richmond now. Tell Mr. Harov there was a fire." Say you don't know where Crenshaw is. Stay until tomorrow. Understand? Thomas nodded. He understood, an alibi, a reason to be away when the fire started. If asked, he had been sent to fetch Harov. He couldn't have started the fire because he wasn't there. Thomas left immediately, walking toward Richmond in darkness, the fire's glow fading behind him. He walked 3 hours to the city's outskirts, rested in a grove of trees, and waited for dawn. Back at the plantation, the fire burned through the night. By dawn, the tobacco barn was a smoking ruin of charred wood and ash. Other buildings were saved, but the barn and the curing crop were gone. Buried in the ashes was Virgil Crenshaw's body. Edmund Harov arrived around noon on August 14, summoned by Thomas, who had found him at his Richmond townhouse that morning. Harov was shocked, barn destroyed, crop lost, overseer dead. The county sheriff, William Foster, arrived 3 days later. A practical man in his 50s with 20 years' experience investigating plantation fires, he'd seen many accidents, overturned lanterns, forged sparks, lightning, and a few deliberate acts, usually obvious. Foster interviewed Harov first, who said Crenshaw was a good overseer, yields had increased, no major conflicts known. He interviewed Ruth, who said Thomas had seen Crenshaw go into the barn with a lantern that night, stumbling as if drunk. Thomas, working late in the carpenter's shop, saw smoke minutes later, ran for help, but the fire was too big. Then Ruth sent him to Richmond to fetch Harov. Other enslaved people told the same story. Crenshaw had been drinking, went to check the tobacco, fire started. A tragic, not uncommon, accident. Foster examined the ruins, found lantern remains near the fire's origin, supporting the overturned lantern theory. Crenshaw's body was burned beyond recognition, identifiable only by his pistol and coat buttons. Foster wrote his report and closed the case. Accident due to overturned lantern. Crenshaw died in the line of duty. No evidence of foul play. Crenshaw was buried in an unmarked plantation grave, soon forgotten. Edmund Harov hired a gentler overseer, Robert Hayes. The tobacco crop was a total loss, but insurance allowed rebuilding and replanting next spring. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but something had changed, a sense of possibility, that men like Crenshaw weren't invincible. Then, 3 weeks after the fire, something strange happened, another fire, in a slave cabin. Small, quickly extinguished, but alarming. The cabin belonged to Peter, a Crenshaw favorite who had informed on others for privileges. The fire started at night while Peter slept. He woke to a smoldering mattress, put it out, but the message was clear, informers weren't safe. A week later, another fire in the kitchen house, also put out quickly. The pattern was unmistakable, someone was setting fires, targeting specific people and places. Edmund Harov grew convinced the plantation was cursed. He spent more time in Richmond, leaving Hayes in charge. Hayes, nervous from the stories about Crenshaw, treated the enslaved people fairly, avoiding cruelty. The fires continued, small, contained, never causing serious damage but appearing unexpectedly. Whispers spread, Crenshaw's ghost haunting the plantation, divine punishment for cruelties. But a few, Ruth, Marcus, Hannah, suspected the truth. Ruth confronted Thomas one evening. "You have to stop," she signed, hands shaking. "They'll figure out it's you." "I'm not setting fires," Thomas signed. "Don't lie. I know what you did to Crenshaw. I know what you're doing now. Stop before they catch you." Thomas was quiet, then signed, "I'm not setting fires, but I'm not stopping them either." Ruth understood, the fires were set by others, Marcus, Hannah, perhaps more, people who had seen what happened to Crenshaw, realizing fire could be a weapon of resistance. Thomas hadn't started a rebellion, he had started an idea. And ideas, once planted, are nearly impossible to extinguish. Marcus had set Peter's cabin fire as a warning to informers. Hannah had set the kitchen house fire as a reminder that even the main house was vulnerable. Others with grievances joined, careful, setting small, controlled fires that sent a message without catastrophic damage. The message was clear: we are not powerless. We can fight back. By spring 1860, Edmund Harrove had enough. He sold the plantation to a North Carolina buyer and moved permanently to Richmond. The new owner lasted less than a year before selling, unable to handle the constant fires, fear, and suspicion. The property changed hands 3 more times before the Civil War broke out in 1861. By war's end in 1865, the main house had burned down in another mysterious fire, large enough to consume it entirely. The land was abandoned, divided, and sold off. Thomas lived to see emancipation. At 24, when the war ended, he left Virginia for Philadelphia, found work as a carpenter, married Clara, a deaf woman, and had 3 children. He built a good, free life, one he'd never imagined possible on the Harrove plantation. He never spoke of August 14, 1859, never told anyone he locked Virgil Crenshaw in the burning barn. He carried that secret to his grave when he died in 1903 at 62. But the story survived, passed down through descendants of those enslaved at Harrove, whispered in kitchens and parlors until it became part history, part legend. Some versions said Thomas had magical powers or made a deal with the devil. The oldest, closest to truth, said simply he was a young man pushed too far, who saw too much cruelty, and decided if the law wouldn't give justice, he would take it himself. The land remains in Virginia's Tidewater, about 40 miles south of Richmond. The main house, barns, and cabins are gone. Only a weed-choked stone foundation and a small cemetery remain, Crenshaw's unmarked grave long forgotten. But on certain nights with the right wind, nearby residents say they still smell smoke. And if you stand very still and listen carefully, you might hear pounding on a door, a voice lost in the roar of flames. This mystery shows history is never as simple as textbooks suggest. The line between victim and perpetrator, justice and revenge, is often blurred beyond recognition. Thomas was denied every form of justice, protection, and humanity, so he took matters into his own hands the only way he knew. Was he justified? Or did he become what he fought? These questions lack easy answers, each of us must answer for ourselves. What do you think? Was Thomas justified, or did his actions cross a line? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this dark historical tale, subscribe to Roots of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves such mysteries. See you in the next video.